Order. I call to order today's Defence Committee evidence session on defence in the grey zone. This is, in fact, our last evidence session for this inquiry, and it is a ministerial one. I am very, very pleased to welcome our guests on the panel today, namely Minister Luke Pollard, who is the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Armed Forces. We also have with us Mr. Paul Wyatt, the Director General for Security Policy at the Ministry of Defence, and I'm also pleased to welcome Air Commodore Matt Bresani, who is the Head of Military Strategic Effects at the Ministry of Defence. A very, very warm welcome to all of yourselves, and indeed, Mr. Pollard, I believe this is your first outing with the Defence Committee, so very, very warm welcome. I'm sure the members will make you feel very welcome during the hearing. But before I come deeply into defence in the grey zone, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to get something on the record. There were shocking revelations from last night around the signal messaging group, which involved senior US defence and other officials. And given our previous involvement in strikes against the Houthis, I just wanted to ask yourself whether you can confirm, have any British servicemen and women have their lives been put at risk as an account of what has been revealed within the messaging group?
No, all UK service personnel are covered by our normal approach to operational security, and the committee will understand that I won't go into the details of how we keep our involvement in any support for military operations in the Red Sea or anywhere else, but we've got high confidence that the measures that we have with our allies, including the United States, remain intact.
Good. I did want to give you that opportunity because I think it's important that you've helped to reassure the nation that no British servicemen and women's lives have been put at risk. Now, just moving on to obviously defence in the grey zone, you will have begun to appreciate that the committee has spent quite a considerable amount of time, our predecessor Defence Committee as well as the newly elected and appointed committee on this matter, and I hope that in the upcoming strategic defence review that there will be significant emphasis on how we tackle and overcome threats in particular from our adversaries. But Minister, where exactly are we with the strategic defence review? Because we've had mixed messaging from certain quarters, especially within the media. When is the government looking to publish it?
I'd always be cautious about listening to speculation in the media. The position on the Strategic Defence Review has not changed. The work is well advanced, as the Prime Minister said last week. We still intend to publish in the spring, and that will be part of measures that will be reported from Lord Robertson and his review team to the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and the Defence Secretary, and then the Prime Minister has been clear that he will then take that Strategic Defence Review to the House of Commons and report it formally to Parliament.
Good. Look, and within the SDR, what exactly are you looking to publish from the SDR process itself? The reason why I say that is because the Secretary of State in a November evidence session with our committee, he promised and he committed to greater government transparency with our committee, and I'm very, very grateful to him in particular, and I want to place on record my thanks to him and other officials, your good selves, for facilitating the classified and secret briefing sessions for our committee members. That has helped to inform our opinion on matters. But you'll be aware that the detailed output from the review has at times been forthcoming in previous strategic defence reviews. So can you confirm what specifically are you planning to publish in the SDR?
Well, it will be for Lord Robertson, as this review is externally led, to create his report. That will then be sent to the Prime Minister, Chancellor and Defence Secretary. What we'd probably expect is that there would be further announcements by the Ministry of Defence as we seek to operationalise what would be a strategic review, looking at the high-level threats that we face. The terms of reference for the Strategic Defence Review were published when the Prime Minister launched the review on the 16th of July last year, and the work of Lord Robertson will reflect the terms of reference for his review, and then it will be to the Ministry of Defence to take the recommendations and operationalise them, reflecting the fact that we live in a very difficult and changed world, and making sure that we can keep our country safe at home and secure abroad.
Good. Look, I know your comments. I know the comments are regarding media coverage, but there has been some concern in defence quarters because Jonathan Powell, the National Security Advisor, he's reported to be lobbying for the SDR to be wrapped up into a wider cross-government assessment of threats. Now, this would appear to be at odds with what the Prime Minister's response was on the floor of the House. Can you just confirm to us definitely that the Strategic Defence Review will be published and it won't just be wrapped up into a wider cross-government departmental process?
I mean, the intent of the department has not changed from when it was announced in July last year. The Prime Minister has been clear that in addition to the Strategic Defence Review, which is an MOD-led review, albeit externally led by Lord Robertson, the reviewers, there's a parallel review taking place largely out of the Home Office with the Strategic Security Review. He announced, I think it was last week before now, that his intention is to create a national security strategy, which will reflect the threats that we face, not just on a military basis, but as the whole of government approach to looking at the challenges that face UK security and how this government is seeking to meet them. And certainly one of the challenges which has been apparent since we came to office in July is that there's a lot of security architecture across government. There's some incredible pockets of best practice, and one of the things that we are keen to do is to join up those expertise more to make sure that we have a better effect from the facilities, the people, and the capabilities that we have across government at the moment. And that's the intent, I think, behind where the Prime Minister is going with the national security strategy.
Good. That's good, because some of such scrutiny is not possible on the floor of the House. It's important that your good self as the Minister was given the opportunity and now to get certain things on record and to allay some of our concerns and the wider defence community's concerns. But I want to bring in my colleague Lincoln Jopp on this point as well.
Yeah, Minister, you said that the Defence Review will reflect its terms of reference, though the Robertson Review is a 2.5% review. It's been slightly overtaken by events because the Prime Minister has now said that it'll be 3% in the next Parliament. Are you going to have another review to work out how to spend that additional, or will the SDSR be sufficient and the operationalising thereof to take account of the 3% ambition?
No, I'm really confident that it will provide the opportunity to us to bring forward a capability situation for our armed forces at 2.5% earlier than originally planned. So the 2.5% level that will reach by April 2027, I think, provides the opportunity for us to embark on deeper reform of our defence apparatus to meet the challenges that we're facing, and having the glide path that will take us to 3% in the next Parliament when the economic conditions allow, I think allows us to look at the threats that we're facing against. For the very first time, there's not a single person in the Ministry of Defence in civilian roles or in uniform that will have served with a decade of rising defence spending. So that does mean a different challenge as to how we as a department, we as a government approach that period. But the recommendations that I'm expecting that Lord Robertson will come out with will be true to a 2.5% world, but also provide the opportunities for us to develop capabilities and reform defence that will help deliver a 3% world. And I think it's worth stressing that if we don't have deep defence reform, we won't be able to deliver the maximum value out of that 2.5% world, let alone a 3% world, because we know that we've inherited a situation where our forces were underfunded and hollowed out. We also know from the experience in Ukraine where warfare is changing and definitions of what is the close and the deep have fundamentally moved from where I think we originally felt they were only a few years ago to where they are in practice today. That does mean that we need to look again at capabilities, look again at our doctrine, and I'm expecting Lord Robertson to make recommendations to meet those challenges. But I'm confident that the increased spending that we've been able to secure and the greater focus on not just capabilities but how we reform defence procurement via my colleague Maria Eagle, I think will help us drive more change, deliver more value out of the increased defence spending we have.
Good. Thank you very much, Mr. I believe Mike Martin wanted to come in on this as well.
Thanks. Just on a slightly different topic, Minister, what actions would you take if you found out that the Air Commodore and Mr. Wyatt had been sharing classified operational plans on Signal?
I can understand why you're going down that line with the question. The Ministry of Defence has very clear policies in relation to what information can be shared and the format at which it can be shared. We don't comment on how allies share their information for good reason.
Forgive me for interrupting. I'm not asking you to comment on our allies. What is that government policy? When I was in Afghanistan, I saw a staff sergeant who, by mistake, took a disk from a top secret machine and put it into a secret machine, thus compromising, it went into the wrong system that wasn't cleared to carry that data. His clearance was withdrawn and he was sent home from Afghanistan. His career was over. So is that government policy in the United Kingdom?
Certainly we take security classifications very seriously in the UK Armed Forces and across the Ministry of Defence, and we have a variety of policies that set out how information should be used and how it should be shared, and that is, I think all officials and military personnel will be familiar with those, and certainly as a relatively new minister, what has been made clear to me is what my role is in making sure that when information is given to me, how I use that information appropriately, and I'm confident that we have robust measures to safeguard our information and our data, but we also have a very clear set of systems where individuals don't follow procedures with sufficient consequences to reflect the actions that have been taken.
What would those consequences be if somebody took classified operational plans that were occurring in the next 24 or 48 hours and shared them on a messaging app? What would those consequences be? What actions would you take as a minister?
Again, I understand why you're going down this line. Certainly, it would depend on the context, the information that was being shared, who was sharing it in terms of which place in the chain of command. But my general rule would be that if there's operational decisions that are being taken, we should all, regardless of our role within defence, take our information sharing seriously, and there would be a clear consequence and disciplinary process for anyone that wouldn't be following those procedures.
It's not acceptable, is it?
If anyone was sharing information in our system that we're sharing it outside of the authorised systems that allow that data sharing, certainly we have clear procedures in place for how we would address those.
Good.
Very good, thank you. So on to a slightly easier topic. What would you say is the nature of the hybrid threat to the United Kingdom?
You say easier question.
we can go back to, if you like, we can go back to...
I think we'll move on from the signal messaging. We'll definitely come on to the hybrid threat section.
Certainly, how you define hybrid threats would be the first challenge to scrutinise there, because the Ministry of Defence doesn't use the definitions grey zone or hybrid threats in the same way we use state threats as our definition. Our allies would use slightly different language as well, and it's certainly true that even some of our closest allies have a different terminology for some of the things. Broadly, though, we're talking about activities that fall sub-threshold, so prior to conflict. And in that situation, we're certainly seeing the threats evolve. We're certainly seeing a deepening of threats that the United Kingdom and our allies face. What we're also seeing, I think, is a greater public awareness of some of those threats. And some of that is because we have, as a government, decided to call out activities of our adversaries, placing that information in the public domain deliberately in order to deter or to call out malign activities. I think also as we've moved to a more digital environment, it's certainly true that I think more people are familiar with their own personal digital safety and the digital safety of their workplaces, whatever that may be. And that has, I think, brought into stark contrast just the levels of threats that we face to the United Kingdom. But when we're looking at grey zone, sub-threshold, hybrid, however you define it, that could cover nearly everything the Ministry of Defence currently does, other than the kinetic activity in certain locations, for instance, op-shader activities over Syria, for instance. So it covers an enormous amount of what we do, but I should say also that the Ministry of Defence is only responsible and only delivers a certain amount of HMG activity in relation to grey zone hybrid state threats. And so our colleagues in the Home Office, for instance, DCIT, FCDO, a whole range of government departments play their role in being able to meet some of those challenges as well. And we see our role as, yes, taking a lead where it comes to those that affect a military instrument or where we have a particular specialism, but also being very clear that our role is to cooperate, collaborate and integrate with our colleagues across government, and that is what we are increasingly doing, and I would expect us to do more of in the future.
Thank you. And I mean, that leads me in perfectly to my next question, which is, who's in charge of all this? I mean, yesterday you were asked in the chamber, who is the minister who's responsible for our undersea cables? And I'd ask you the same question. I mean, you answered by saying, well, the Prime Minister is, of course, and he delegates it. But who's responsible for responding to the hybrid threat, whatever terminology we use? And yes, obviously it's the Prime Minister, but which minister is it delegated to? Because the cross-departmental amorphous soup that you described kind of reflects the nature of the threat, and that doesn't necessarily help us respond to it. So who's in charge?
So the answer is, it is the Prime Minister, and he delegates it to a cross-government approach. And I think the reason that it is important to stress that is that the Ministry of Defence doesn't take any action broadly in this area on our own. We take it as part of a joined up integrated HMG wide approach. So and it's hard because grey zone covers so much, for instance, that if we take an example like cable defence, for instance, so the safe operation of cables normally and undersea infrastructure like that would be a DCIT responsibility. Industry would have a role in terms of the regular surveying and data collection of their infrastructure. Ministry of Defence will clearly have a role in terms of that wider defence bubble that we might place over particular assets. Our colleagues over in transport would have a role in terms of the maritime environment, and that is cohered together via the Cabinet Office that many cases would lead any response to any incidents, or also ensure that we are working together effectively. And so, although the answer might not be as clear cut as saying it's Bob over there.
The Cabinet Office, though, that's interesting. Are they the clearinghouse for these decisions?
In some cases, across government, the Cabinet Office does function as a convening power to bring people together. And I think what has been true, and I'm kind of stealing Pat McFadden's approach here, I think the Cabinet Office functions differently under this government than perhaps under the last government, because it has fewer discrete additional things attached to it, which didn't really sit anywhere else, so they put it in the Cabinet Office. Our attempt as the Cabinet Office is to have very clear mission-led government run out of the Cabinet Office, and that convening function, especially in areas where, to secure our underwater infrastructure, for instance, we do need activities from across government with different responsibilities because of different expertises and centres of excellence across government to be able to convene those functions together. I mean, the officials and our military colleagues will work operationally on a day-to-day basis with people right outside the department, across government, and in many cases across our international partners as well, and that is just normal everyday business. So I entirely understand the temptation to say, in the absence of one person we can point out who is it, but actually the way that we approach grey zone challenges is actually by playing to our strengths and having an integrated approach, and that is what we will be seeking to develop more of, because if we took the opposite approach and replicate every capability within every department in order to do it, that's inefficient. If we took the approach that there's only one minister that's responsible for any one thing, they would have to reach out across government and be briefed from a variety of different departments at the same time. So I feel pretty confident that this integrated approach is the right one, but it doesn't make an easy answer on the Commons when you're trying to get a quick soundbite and a video clip, I understand.
Last very short question. So I accept what you say, that it's cross-departmental and ultimately responsibility rests with the Prime Minister. So if there is a successful hybrid attack on our critical national infrastructure, will it be the Prime Minister's fault?
I think the Prime Minister takes his responsibility to national security incredibly seriously, and he feels that very personally. I have to say, in terms of his approach to how he's addressing the increasingly difficult world in which we find ourselves as a nation. But I think it's absolutely true that it is a team sport when we're keeping our country safe, and it would depend on the nature of the hybrid threat, about the mix of government departments and cross-government activities. Indeed, you might see more industry involved with one approach, or more international partners, and some of our hybrid threats aren't geographically bound in the way that perhaps a threat to a cable is very specific in a location, but a cyber threat, for instance, might not be geographically bound in the same way. And so you would draw in different expertise in relation to that, and it would be a team sport when it comes to it.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Calvin Bailey.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting to come in here on this point. And I think
more than happy. We'll be coming in later on. I thought you indicated earlier that you'd wanted to come in there. Fred Thomas, please.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, you described a couple of hybrid threats, and you talked about a slight change over the last year since Labour have come into government about how the government communicates those threats to the public and increased public awareness. And we remember earlier this year the government telling the public about the deployment of a submarine to surface next to a Russian spy boat in British waters, which was marked a departure from previous policy where that would all be classified much too highly to release. That was timed fairly shortly before an announcement of increased defence spending. Can you give us now a sense of the government's assessment of how hybrid threats are changing, what's current, and what the future looks like in terms of these sub-threshold activities?
Yeah, I might bring colleagues in to give some more detailed examples in response to your question, but broadly, we took a decision as ministers to declassify not just the activities of the Russian spy ship Yantar, but also our response to it as a clear deterrent activity that would prevent Russia being able to operate in the same way in the future. And so the decision on timings for that, the activity that we declassified was from Yantar's movement from the North Sea through our waters and then further south. And it was during that period where the activities of the Yantar was followed by not only Royal Navy vessels, Royal Fleet Auxiliary, but also the RAF as well. And it was at that point that we took the decision to surface a Royal Navy submarine next to the spy ship Yantar, and then the ship left, I think is the best way of describing what happened then. We declassified that information on the return leg of the Yantar. So the decision, the timing, was partly driven, actually mainly driven by the Yantar's journey back from the Mediterranean up through the Atlantic and back into our EEZ. We wanted to make sure that our deterrent message was as effective as it could be in order to do that. And that was, I think, it was a useful, demonstration of a different approach. And so it is normal for us not to comment at all on the activities of our submarine fleet for a very good reason. We felt as ministers that the consequences of the Yantar's activity, not just in isolation in UK waters and in our wider EEZ, but in the context of cable breaks in the Baltic and other activities affecting our allies' undersea infrastructure, not just those in UK waters, meant that we needed a stronger response. And I think one of the key bits about the credibility of a UK response, both in terms of deterrence but also in terms of how allies look to us, is being able to identify a perpetrator and say it was this ship or this malign actor that had undertaken this piece of hybrid activity. Well, it not only makes our adversaries think again about acting against the UK, because we will identify their actions. So there's a deterrent piece there. But it also means that every time the Yantar leaves port now, the entire world can identify that as a Russian spy ship.
It's brilliant. But if I could bring you on to talk about how hybrid threat is changing, because we're quite aware of the threat to undersea cables. But what are some of the things that are known but aren't kind of publicly, haven't made the front page yet? Can you give us a bit of a kind of elaboration of the government assessment of how hybrid threats are changing?
Yeah, I might bring colleagues in to particularly answer that. But as a high-level one, what we're seeing is an increase in sub-threshold activity, which can have an influence in both the UK and our allies. And some of that is using technologies that already exist. And so drones are a good example of that. For instance, the MOD operates a good counter-UAS capability, but we're seeing dual use. Effectively, drones are a dual use activity, and the developments, as we're seeing in Ukraine, provide more opportunities, for instance, for those to do. But I would just be cautious about placing too much into the public domain, because what we don't want to do is set out, here's the list of threats that we face, and that malign actors could then use it as a to-do list. But some of those are already in the public domain.
I'll say one that's in the public domain, which the paper online published a story earlier this year about having been able to geolocate, they say, individuals who they say were Russian proxies, who they say they were able to track from some farming activity in Europe, travelled to the UK, and apparently happened to be located very near the air bases which drones were flown above, and that stopped some of the UK activity from those UK air bases. So that's already in the public domain. Are you able to comment about what the government position is on whether we are at an increased level of threat from that kind of disruptive, very low level and very easy to achieve activity?
Well, we wouldn't comment on operational activities or intelligence matters as a matter of default, so I wouldn't be able to comment on that specific example. But what I think we can say, and if we were to point to activities that are in the public domain in relation to a similar type of cohort, we know that there has been Russian-backed activities in the United Kingdom in relation to both the escalation of criminal activities, but also the effect on infrastructure that potentially could come from those. That is in the public domain. But that's a really good example, for instance, of where there's a temptation to say, because it's a Russian activity, it must be the Ministry of Defence that responds to it. In many cases, that is a National Crime Agency response, which would be led by the Home Office, and in particular, Dan Jarvis, the Security Minister, the Home Secretary. So how we approach those particular problems gives a good approach to actually, it needs to be a cross-government way. But I might ask colleagues just to add additional.
I just wanted to, Minister, as you said earlier, that you wanted the Air Commodore and the Director General to come in on examples to answer Mr. Thomas's questions. So, Air Commodore, Director General, do you have anything to add to this?
So, I mean, I was going to go to the same place that the Minister did, actually, which is there are obviously a number of examples of Russian-linked criminality, particularly arson attacks, and kind of, we can pick one, for example. So in March 24, charges were brought against criminal actors with a acknowledged linkage to kind of a Russia connection against a warehouse that was connected to kind of a Ukrainian interest and ownership. So that's quite a good example of the kind of things that we're seeing. I think that proliferation of the use of criminal contacts to generate more threats is absolutely the kind of change that we're seeing.
And I think from my perspective, it was quite well put in a previous session when a previous witness described to you that essentially the threat surfaces are both increasing in size, but also in the amount of surfaces that are out there. So almost the threat can come from anywhere and through any domain. This was recognised and has been recognised by military doctrine for quite a number of years, and we now, everything we plan comes from a view of whether we are, I don't know if you're familiar with the integrated operating concept that was published a few years ago, but essentially we deem all sub-threshold activity to either protect, engage or constrain. So protect our homeland, protect ourselves, protect our allies, engage with our allies and friends abroad, and then also constrain adversaries where needed. And so all of our activity is planned and hopefully executed along those lines in a sub-threshold manner.
Okay, thank you. Minister, you described the UK needing to show credibility, needing a stronger response to show that. And you also spoke about how grey zone or hybrid warfare is all sub-threshold, i.e. the threshold of war, or people talk about pre-war. It's all about deterrence. It's all about a push and pull of deterring actual war. A large part of deterrence is making sure that your adversary doesn't want to do something. Our military, our wider armed forces, as it stands at the moment, do you think that they're strong enough to deter a peer adversary?
Yes, but we want to do more. Okay. And I think the deterrence by denial, which effectively is what you're getting at, is about making sure that we have the capabilities, the credibility, and the intent to basically deter any action before it takes place. And that is part of a broad range of tools that the Ministry of Defence and indeed across government that we would have in the grey zone space that would enable us to pick and choose from a much broader toolbox in any particular situation.
Good. Last one. The move to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence in over 2 years' time, there are people, for example, a former leader of the Labour Party, Neil Kinnock, several former defence secretaries who say that that is nowhere near enough to credibly deter a peer adversary like Russia, which that's the game we're in now. Do you think that 2.5% in over 2 years' time is honestly anywhere near enough of an increase to deter Russia?
It's precisely the reason why we've actually set out clear policy to move to 3% in the next Parliament. What we do need to demonstrate with 2.5% is a journey to reform our armed forces so that money is spent better than it has been in the past. That deep defence reform that we need to take place is not only in procurement processes, in trusting our people more, in renewing the contract between the nation and those who serve, actually genuinely valuing service more, but it also is about making sure that we can, on behalf of the British people, be a credible spender of more defence money, which means, in my mind, directing more of that money at UK firms, especially SMEs, where we know that defence can be an engine for growth. But when it comes to that credibility of deterrence, we don't fight alone. We fight as part of a broader collection of nations. And actually, what you'll be seeing from the SDR and the announcements since we came to office is that NATO first approach, is that clear focus that when it comes to deterrence, when it comes to our interoperability and increasingly interchangeability of the kit and equipment, the fighting forces that we have to respond to any challenge or to deter any challenge, well, we need to increase our lethality of that. We do that by investing more in our people, investing more in our equipment, and by working together more. That creates a greater deterrence in a conventional sense, but also it creates sub-threshold deterrence measures as well. And so taken together, we need to spend money better. We are seeing an unprecedented rise in defence spending, the biggest since the Cold War. It is now the Ministry of Defence's job to spend that well and to clearly demonstrate that if in spending it well, not only can we have a greater military deterrent effect, but we can also be an engine for growth across the country. Good. And the Secretary of State's intention is to do both of those.
Just to explore deterrence further, I wanted to bring in Derek Twigg, please.
I don't think it was.
I just wanted to come in on the back of.
Sorry.
Thank you. Minister, you'll be aware that last year the previous iteration of this committee did a report saying ready for war, where it highlighted that we are significantly lacking in kit and personnel. That was only around 12 months ago. And at the time, we also said that you can't just keep saying we will rely on our allies. And what we've seen recently is allies' priorities change. What they want to do in defence sometimes changes. So what's different now than when we did that report?
I think it's a very good report that the committee did. And I think it was a really useful one in actually highlighting the state of our forces at any one given moment. So as a minister, if we ask our forces to do a thing, can they do it? Yes. Can they provide credible deterrence? Yes. Do we want them to do more, potentially, and provide greater deterrence? Certainly. And to do that, we've got to address some of the failings and the gaps that were found in your report, but also in the day-to-day understanding of where we are. Now, some of those gaps have been created by the very genuine and the right thing to do of gifting equipment from our inventory to our friends in Ukraine. We need to make sure we're replacing that inventory, which I don't think was done at the pace it was required to do under the last government. We've set out that with the Strategic Defence Review, looking at the capabilities we need, is it a simple one-in, one-out approach? It probably isn't. It's looking at how do we adapt our capabilities to meet those challenges and to learn the lessons of Ukraine. So that means when it comes to the shape of the forces that we're seeking to create, that will be informed by the SDR's approach, but it's also been informed by the daily practice that we're seeing in Ukraine, because that is a war being fought by a peer adversary. So we can see the way that Russia fights, we can see the way that Russia operates, and that gives us more information to be able to design a credible deterrent force against those. But that does involve working with our allies.
I suppose, Minister, what I was driving at is, in that report, we found that we're not ready for an enduring war. What has changed between that report and now? Would we now be ready for one?
So we are making changes to the system of procurement. We're trying to remove the barriers and the obstacles so we can refill our stockpiles. We have increased defence spending in the budget last year by 2.9 billion, and with an increased budget kicking in of 2.5% from April. That does provide the resources to create the renewal of our forces. And that's the reason why one of the first actions, not just that the MOD took, but the government took, was to commission the SDR to understand what shape our forces need to be structured in to get there. So there's been quite a lot of change in terms of fixing the foundations. I would also argue that one of the fundamental failings of much of the defence debate that I've seen when I was in opposition was an over-focus on kit and an under-focus on the people who serve. So it's for that reason...
Our report, to be clear, though, covered both. And I suppose what I'm after, Minister, is just we found that we were not ready for an enduring war. Are we yet, or is there still work in progress, is what I'm trying to get from you.
We are still making changes. There's still work to do. We have to refill our stockpiles. We have to reform defence procurement. We have to value our people more. We have to fix a broken recruitment and retention system. Now, against all of those, we're making progress. The SDR, I think, will really help as a catalyst to show the future shape of our force that we wish to move towards.
We're not ready yet, are we, Minister?
We've still got more work to do.
Okay.
Good. Eric, quick, please.
Does the MOD know what resources it's allocated to countering the hybrid threats? Does it have any idea what resource it's allocated, whether it's enough and what the gaps are?
I would question back, what do you mean by hybrid threats there? Because effectively anything below active kinetic activity could be covered by hybrid threats in their definition, in which we can point to nearly all our budgets being in that direction. If there's particular hybrid threats that we're looking at, I mean, certainly the approach that I expect will be coming out of the SDR, and certainly one that the Secretary of State and myself have spoken about a number of times since July last year, is we need to invest in particularly increased homeland defence, which does include cable infrastructure, it does include cyber and digital protections for not just the defence systems, but for the wider industry. Now, some of that is an MOD responsibility, but some of that is also the responsibility of other departments for whom we rely on as well to go and deliver greater effect. So I would certainly want to see greater investment in some of those capabilities, but as a broad bit, hybrid threats in general, or state threats is the way we regard them, is such a broad part of our budget and the response across government. Would I like more money there? Yes, we are getting more money to be able to support that. But on an individual line basis, we'd need to look at what is the particular threat, what's the particular response, and what is the MOD role in countering that response to be able to give you a full answer.
I suppose going back to your terminology in terms of state threats, I mean, how was that in the last 5-10 years? How has that become more of a difficulty in terms of resources that you've got to counter state threats, and defence's contribution to that. I get it, it's a government-wide approach, but I'm just trying to, get some sort of handle on, basically where you're at in terms of being able to actually provide the resources that you basically the situation is now demanding. I mean, you've talked before about servicing a submarine and having the RAF involved and so on, but that's fine. But we don't know actually how many operations just as a matter of interest, how many operations have you been involved in the last 12 months?
Well, as a former minister, you'll know that I won't be able to give an answer to that last question.
I'm not asking for the detail of what the operations were. I'm asking for how many operations have you been involved in.
I wouldn't be able to give an answer on that one because it would depend on what we mean by operations.
Because you're not surfing a submarine every day, I guess, so that's one thing out of the way. So. You may be, for all I know, but I guess
we try to keep the submarines out of sight as a general rule. But just before, I think Paul.
Yeah. So I'm just going to make an observation. So it's costing against threats is incredibly difficult. It's something that we have tried kind of endlessly, frankly, as a government against.
But you don't have the money, then you can't do.
In some ways, focusing on costing against the capabilities that we need is a way that we can kind of get after this in a way that's got a bit more kind of bite and grip to it. So, from a CT perspective, for example, our quick reaction aircraft are available to support kind of air threats. But they're not just there for CT, they're there for state threats, they're there for the integrity of UK airspace. So costing against threats becomes incredibly complicated and ends up with quite a lot of subjective judgment. What we can absolutely do, though, is we can look at what capabilities we are offering to defence and to other government departments. So kind of quite a good example is our counter improvised explosive device, counter explosive ordnance disposal capabilities. Now, those are available to deal with unexploded ordnance from previous wars. They're available to deal with IEDs that have a malign actor behind them, or indeed terrorist attack. Quite hard to kind of attribute what threat they're really against, but we absolutely can understand what the government wants of us, which is coverage outside the M25, and the costs associated with that. So we tend to take an approach based on capability rather than threat.
I think one of the things we're trying to get at is that how much is this area now taking up, in terms of the impact it's having on defence's ability to provide the resources and people and equipment. I mean, that's part of the inquiry's reason, And so what I think you're saying is that you haven't really got a handle because it's all spread out all over the place and no one really knows. Is that what you're saying?
I think it's our job to employ the force against a range of requirements. I think what we're saying is that we've got a tool set that we use against a range of different threats, and they're not quite so niche or tailored as allows you to say that is for this.
What I would say, though, in respect to your answer, is there has been some very clear changes. For instance, the move of the British Army from being an expeditionary force fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, for instance, to now being much more orientated against a state threat, Russia. That does change the force posture. It changes what kit and equipment we need in relation to that. I think there's also newer technologies that we'd need to develop that would be different than perhaps we had 5 years ago. If you look at drones, for instance, and counter drones as a technology, that would certainly be a change in where we were from previous defence reviews, looking at that. Certainly, if you look at the role of, say, misinformation and the pervasive nature of misinformation in some contexts, the malign actors behind it, that is a cross-government response, but clearly MOD has a role within it. Cyber would be another one where you would expect to see a greater investment required to meet the challenges, but also to reflect the fact that our people are in much greater demand as an industry because the skills that our people have don't exist separate from the wider economy, and certainly the high-end cyber skills that we train our people in, people learn an awful lot in the private sector to deliver that. So that has changed how we structure, for instance, some of those cyber responses to deal with the fact that the economic situation for our people has changed, the threat has changed, so therefore we need to restructure. So because hybrid is such a large amount of government activity, it's hard to answer particularly, but I think there are certain common themes where you can see a requirement for defence to invest more, and my expectation would be that when Lord Robertson reports, there would be areas where he would be making recommendations for additional investment to meet the iteration of threats that we are facing today.
Even though we don't know what the investment is currently.
I mean, we know what our budget is currently.
Yeah, we know
it's just that if you are saying, a typhoon can be a response to a hybrid threat as well as a conventional threat as well. So how you would count those, and I think this underlines the difficulty of how this area is approached in public debate and your inquiry, in the fact that you can count them separately, we could draw lines across it. I think that's an unhelpful approach to how we look at the capabilities that defence has. There's certainly more capabilities we want to invest in to meet the threats we're facing. The increased defence budget allows us to look at what those capabilities are once the SDR reports.
Yeah. So my final point is a question to you. Given that we've seen you've described the aggressive action from the Russian ship coming, are we too soft? Are we not being proactive enough and actually taking more action against the adversaries than we do? We just always reactive rather than being more proactive. Could we be more on the front foot?
Well, I think you've seen from this government examples where we are being more proactive.
Yeah.
I think
give us some of them apart from the one you just.
So I think Yantar is a really good example of that.
What about others where you're being proactive?
Would also point to the broader area of UK leadership when it comes to Ukraine, because quite a lot of our counter-Russia activity obviously has a Ukrainian flavour to it in terms of our support for Ukraine. So we're spending more than before, 4.5 billion this year in our support for Ukraine. That's not just in ammunition, 155 shells and other forms of equipment and ammunition. It is in the wider support packages as well that we provide to our friends there. That's stepping up of UK leadership in terms of what we've seen over the past month in particular, alongside our French allies in bringing together a coalition of the willing. Well, the coalition of the willing, in bringing that together in itself, you could argue is a response to both has a deterrent effect but also has a conventional force effect potentially in the future. So I think there are absolutely areas we want to step up and do more.
I understand. So basically, if we found that an adversary had cut one of our undersea cables, would we go and do the same thing to them?
So it's not always an eye for an eye approach. That is.
I'm just saying
the
whether
case here.
that is an option that the government might consider.
So, in the event of any actions being taken against UK infrastructure, we would look at all the options that are available to us. But I think one of the differences between, say, the UK responding to a hybrid threat like a cable cut, for instance, and an adversary doing it is that we draw on different strengths than they do. So our alliances are a key part of our response. The response doesn't necessarily have to be military. It could be economic, it could be diplomatic.
So we'd allow them to take out our communications, but we wouldn't take out their communications.
So we'd keep all options on the table in relation to how that works, but it doesn't necessarily mean it is an eye for an eye. Certainly there is a benefit in not being our adversaries in terms of the approach, but one of these strengths that I think the UK has in deterring some of these activities is that we are part of a strong alliance, that we do have exquisite capabilities that we can use, that the response may not be in the same domain as the initial activity, that we would use messaging, public messaging, calling it out, that affirmation of responsibility. We shouldn't underestimate just what an powerful tool that is in our armoury. So you would look at a broad range of options for any of those.
Okay. Thank you very much. I believe Mike Martin wanted to come in here as well.
Thanks very much, Chair. I was struck, Minister, by you saying that there's been a shift from a sort of expeditionary military to one that's much more focused on Russia and European defence and all that. So, as you know, we're still debating whether to send the carrier strike group to the Far East. And interesting comments about the Red Sea. That's obviously where the risk is in that. But I'd like to focus on something else, which is the opportunity cost of doing that. Mm-hmm. So if we send that carrier strike group with all of the other assets, naval, air, all the rest of it, it's a huge force package. What's the opportunity cost in the Euro-Atlantic security area? What's not being done here in our region because of that deployment?
So deploying the carrier to the Indo-Pacific directly supports our ability to protect the NATO air operations in the future, because the key military purpose as to why we're deploying HMS Prince of Wales is for it to achieve its full operating capability, operating alongside other carriers of our allies which are in the Indo-Pacific. So that's the key military reason why the carrier is being deployed. In terms of the ability of that carrier to project power at any point on its deployment, one of the advantages of maritime power is the ability to move them around. So at all times in any deployment, whether that's for the carrier strike group or for a single ship deployment, we retain the ability to move them and to deploy them in different manners. And that option, those options that are provided by an aircraft carrier, a fifth generation carrier with fifth generation fighters, is quite considerable. So it doesn't preclude options, but at the end of its deployment, we will be able to dedicate a fully tested, a fully operational carrier to SACEUR for its activities in the NATO area operations from next year.
And what would you say the risk is that the carrier strike group passes through the Red Sea, does its deployment, and then the United States tries to extort money from us to provide the necessary protection to get the carrier back through the Red Sea? What risk would you say there is in that happening?
So we have a very strong and deep naval relationship with the US.
Because you've seen the comments last night from very senior American politicians, including the Vice President, about exactly this, about getting the Europeans to pay for American security protection in the Red Sea, which is the key choke point that our carrier has to pass through. Is there a danger that our carrier will get stuck the other side of the Red Sea and not be able to get back through that key choke point because the US withdraws its security guarantee?
Yeah. We are seriously veering off topic as well. I don't really want to get into this carrier strike and so on. And I just do want to bring it back into focus. Obviously, I think you've made your views known on this particular issue. Unless there's something else that you want to add on this, I want to move on to deterrence. Back on deterrence, I believe Emily Buck wanted to come in on that.
Hello again, Minister. Just following on from my colleague Derek's questions, what we know is that in the last 6 weeks, Russian ships have been in UK waters 3 times. So is our approach there of deterrence working or not?
I think it is in relation to what activities we are undertaking alongside those ships. So I think to answer your question fully, we have to look at why are there Russian ships there? And in many cases, the Russian ships are there because they are moving equipment out of their Mediterranean ports in relation to Syria. And so is this an escalation in Russian military activity deliberately designed to influence the United Kingdom? Probably not. It is movement of their goods and equipment out of Syria. But because there is a presence of a Russian vessel near our shores, what we have seen is a strong response, not just from the Royal Navy, but from the Air Force as well, in being able to track and follow those ships, to give the Russians no scope for doing anything other than transit through our waters. And it's worth remembering that as a naval power, we obey the international rules, law of the sea, the UNCLOS Convention, that does allow nations to transit through international waters and our own waters. But let's be under no doubt, the reason we keep on standby ships available to shadow Russian vessels through our waters is to be absolutely clear to those Russians that they have no ability to veer off to do any activities that we will not be able to spot and deter. And what we've seen in recent transits in particular is not just HMS Iron Duke, for instance, the Type 23 frigate shadowing some of those Russian vessels. We've seen greater and more impactful presence of some of the P-8 maritime patrol aircrafts, for instance, showing a greater presence against those ships, and a clearer public communication message from the Ministry of Defence that every time a ship has gone by, we have been identifying it and reassuring the British public that we are shadowing it and thanking those forces that are doing it. I think that is different from where we were perhaps a few years ago for those similar Russian operations.
So what other ways can defence use deterrence to counter hybrid threats? So that's one example. What other ways is there?
So it depends what you mean by hybrid threats. Again, so I'd take you back to this broad thing. But if you were, for instance, to look at, say, Russian shadow fleet as an example, that I think is a good example of how an HMG-wide approach, including Ministry of Defence analysis across with our intelligence partners, has identified which ships are in the Russian shadow fleet, because it's not always easy to tell from the first point of call, to be able to identify them, to publicly call them out, to then sanction their activities, to prevent their access into certain ports or to access certain international activities. That is directly deterring Russian aggression, because it's directly affecting the revenues that the Putin administration receives from the illegal sale of oil on the international markets, for instance. So if you look at that as an example, increased activity against Shadow Fleet has a direct effect and support for our friends in Ukraine by choking off some of the revenue that the administration, that the Russians would receive from that activity. So that would be an example of how that's not necessarily a conventional deterrence, but it is an example of how across HMT, FCDO and MOD and our intelligence partners that we'd be able to bring together that analysis to have an effect that we're looking for.
So just to expand it a little bit, so as you know, the territory Russia has seized with its bite and hold operations in Georgia, Moldova and Ukraine has so far proved impossible to recover. Should the UK enhance our deterrence by denial by forward deploying more military capabilities to deter Russia from crossing the threshold from hybrid into armed conflict?
Yeah, I might bring Paul in here. It's an area that he spends a lot of time working in. If you look at the forward deployed presence that we have already, for instance, so if you're looking at the forward land presence in Estonia, for instance, as a NATO partner, and with NATO partners operating across the Baltic states and now Finland and Sweden being part of NATO as well, the new regional plan that covers that part of the world, for instance, hubbed out of Norfolk, allows us, I think, to not just have a UK presence in Estonia, but to have a greater integration with the presence of our allies in Latvia and Lithuania, in Finland, Sweden, and across the High North. So there is a real benefit to our forward land presence in Estonia, not just for the Estonians, but for the UK security as well. And that is absolutely probably a really good example of conventional deterrence that also allows a forward presence for the UK to conduct information discussions, show our support for our NATO allies, because that visible support of that presence makes such a big difference of reassurance for our allies in that area. And certainly having the Prince of Wales, the person rather than the carrier this time, visit Estonia only last week, I think is a really strong sign of our commitment to that Baltic state's security, but also for the wider region.
Paul? So the Minister's absolutely right. This is something that we don't do unilaterally. We do it very much multilaterally in the context of NATO planning and a combined multilateral NATO endeavour. So we have French forces alongside us in Estonia. We have other major NATO nations in the Baltic. So from our perspective, linked to the, as the Minister said, a NATO first approach, it's about understanding what the demand is from NATO and from SACEUR, and how we play into that in terms of their plans for adequately securing the NATO area. The other thing, very obviously, that we do now and expect to continue to doing is the air policing role that we conduct, so in the Baltic and indeed in Romania. So it's not just a land forces deployments that we play into this space, it's also security of the airspace as well. But the straight answer is it's something that of course we would consider, but in a multilateral context it's very much the force laydown is a matter for NATO and for the NATO commanders, and we support that.
Good. Before we carry on with this line of questioning, Alex Baker needs to leave in because she's a question in the chamber. So I want you to bring her in first, please. Alex Baker.
All right. Thank you, Chair. So you've already touched a little bit on this, but I'd really like to just focus on cyberspace, if you don't mind, which is obviously increasingly part of hybrid operations that we've been talking about. What role can defence play in deterring and countering cyber attacks?
I think an increasingly critical one. So if we take a step back, the UK is under continuous cyber attack from malign actors worldwide. Defence has a role in particular for deterring and supporting certain systems that are critical to UK security. But we operate in conjunction with the National Cyber Security Centre, for instance, which is a brilliant resource and a model that has been copied worldwide now, in how we work alongside industry, the private sector, third sector increasingly as well, due to a lot of tax on charities that we're seeing, but to make sure that we can increase our cyber resilience. And it is really, effectively, going back to the question from Fred in relation to deterrence by denial, that actually our cyber activities, because we are a country with high levels of cyber resilience and high levels of cyber expertise as well, it makes us a less favourable target for some nations to come after. But we should be in no doubt that the level of cyber threats that we face as a country, both on defence networks and in the wider civilian population, are considerable. And that's why some of the developments we've made in recent years I think are so important. The standing up of the National Cyber Force, I think, is a good example of how we can now create a cross-government, effectively, because it's not just owned by the Ministry of Defence, a expertise that builds on the very best of our colleagues over in GCHQ and the wider security apparatus to look at defensive cyber as well as the ability for us to conduct offensive cyber should we need to.
You're confident right now that we have the right people and the right skills to be able to counter the threats we face?
I think we need more people and we need more skills. And so it's for that reason that we launched the direct entry cyber pathway only a few months ago, because we know that some of the skills that we need in cyber are by their very nature different from some of the warfighting skills that we might need on the front line. So we changed, for instance, some of the medical requirements and physical requirements. That would be a difference for someone entering the cyber force on the direct entry pathway rather than, say, a usual entry into Army, Navy or Air Force, deliberately because we want to attract different people with different skills into that area. I think one of the other areas that makes, I think, cyber, but also, say, example, 77 Brigade, for instance, in the Army, different in this respect, is that we need to look again at the mix of regulars and reserve, because in a traditional military laydown, you would expect nearly everyone to be a regular, with top-ups of reserves on a rotational basis or as operational needs require. That's different in cyber. Because we know that the high levels of wages that I mentioned earlier mean that our people are in heavy demand in industry. But what we can offer in the Ministry of Defence, especially in some of our forward-facing cyber units, is a sense of purpose and mission and contribution that is different to the level of pay that someone can receive. So that's why increasingly we're seeing more reservists in those units. Indeed, 77 Brigade is 2/3 reservists, which is a very different kind of personnel mix than you would see in a conventional military unit in any one of our single services. It's that type of adapting our systems that we're going to need to do to make sure we keep our people, but also allow our people to have careers that don't produce a cliff edge, because far too many of our people across defence, but especially true in areas of incredible high demand for their skills, well, it's very binary. You're in the military or not. And what we need to move to is a greater continuum of service, which does mean adapting some of the legislation, and you might see that in the Armed Forces Bill next year, where we're removing some of the cliff edge moments, which will enable people to transition from serving in uniform to serving the nation in the private sector in what might be very similar roles, because especially cyber is supported by many private sector partners, and allowing the transition back and forth between regular reservists and the different types of reservists. It's that model that I think is incredibly effective in getting the people we need and retaining them over the course of their careers, while still enabling them to gain new skills, new experiences outside military service, while still bringing that benefit to our armed forces. If we exist on a very simple cliff edge, you're serving or you're not, we will lose those people. That expertise in our country will not be as safe as a result. So that's why that new model is so important that we're adopting at pace.
Right, and it sounds like that is a really sensible approach in terms of where we're at now, but obviously this is a fast-paced changing environment, and you know, having worked in the private sector myself, I know how important it is in terms of that skills pipeline, that how you do that planning. And you've very eloquently talked about how this is a cross-government approach, that it's not just the MOD. So how are you approaching that sort of, that skills planning piece, making sure we've got the pipeline of talent to face whatever is coming at us in the next decade?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that the MOD needs to do more to recruit and to retain people. In many cases, that's making people aware of the incredible opportunities that a career in service in armed forces provides, because I don't think we've told that story well enough. But we also need to work with our cross-government colleagues, especially if you look at, say, Department for Education in England or its equivalents elsewhere around the United Kingdom, to encourage people at an earlier basis to be aware of the opportunities, to be aware of the skills requirements. So how do we get more people excited about maths, science, engineering, which is precisely the bedrock skills that will be required. It's amazing how many young people now are involved with coding, which is a direct skills development that we could really benefit from in terms of cyber and some of the other advanced technologies that we need across. So it is a whole of government effort, but certainly Defence is doing more and will need to continue to do more.
Thank you very much, Minister. Obviously, my colleague now has to go to the chamber for her health and social care question. And apologies for interrupting Emily Buck earlier, but I believe she's finished her line of questioning. We're moving on now to Calvin Bailey.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Minister. Matt and Paul. So Alex Younger, in fact, first off, the question that I'm going to try and get after I'll set to you before I frame it, but I'm interested in the integrity of our Article 5 response. So Sir Alex Younger, who was former head of SIS, told this committee of grandmother's footsteps nature of the hybrid threat, which is about the slowly increasing harassment or subversion and the normalising of a situation which could result in the blurring of previously robust red lines around security. My personal analogy would be that used of the scientific advisor providing advice to Minister Hacker, and the Russian approach to use salami slicing techniques to slowly gain ground. So in that regard, I couldn't resist writing down a series of escalations and wondering where our Article 5 response would be. You know, spy ship off our coast, push the button. Cutting subsurface cables, do you push the button? Drones at a US Air Force base, do we push the button? Attributable violent attacks on mosques and Muslims, do we push the button? Fostering anti-Semitic behaviour, do we push the button? Damaging our critical national infrastructure, do we push the button? So I'll take you back to the original question. How can defence counter threats to ensure the resilience and integrity of our Article 5 commitments? And does our defence policy adequately address this? And Paul, as the Chief Scientific Advisor in that analogy, I'll perhaps start with you.
I might, if I can, just beforehand, it's always good to get a Yes Minister reference into a question, so good on that. I haven't experienced many Yes Minister moments as a Minister yet, but I'm sure there'll be plenty more in store for me. I think what I would just say is our commitment to NATO is unshakable, and I think it's important to understand that the Article 5 moment, certainly in conventional terms, is not necessarily triggered by, say, a Russian tank coming across the border. It's triggered by a decision of the North Atlantic Council that represents an Article 5 moment. And from 2016, NATO has decided that a hybrid threat, or a cyber threat in particular, could be considered an Article 5 moment if it meets a certain level of severity. Now, the challenge around that is all Article 5 moments are context specific. So, and they need to be decided upon at a political level on the recommendation of where NATO would be. Certainly, it is absolutely vital that we maintain that Article 5 unity amongst our allies, that an attack on one is an attack on all. But it is also true that increasingly NATO allies need to look at hybrid threats and their reaction to it as part of collective defence. So effectively, being resilient against a hybrid threat needs to be viewed as part of your Article 3 commitment on ensuring that you yourself as a nation maintain the adequate defences, so therefore you can contribute to the security of the overall alliance. But what we are seeing increasingly is, although the definitions and terminology will vary across the alliance as to what we mean about hybrid threats and cyber, we're seeing a commonality of approach and increasing cooperation. And on cyber in particular, we're fortunate as a nation that we have some of the very best cyber operators, both defensive and offensive in the alliance. But we also have deep partnerships with our allies, especially those on the eastern flank, for whom hybrid threats are a much more common everyday occurrence because of the proximity of Russia and because the proximity allows them to have a greater freedom and a greater range of options available to them that they might not further into the alliance as we are in the UK. And so the challenge about what represents an Article 5 moment, can a hybrid threat be there? Certainly, about severity, but I would also stress that I cannot imagine a scenario where a conventional Article 5 moment is not accompanied by sub-threshold state threats and actively deploying them alongside, in parallel, immediately preceding any Article 5 conventional moment as we might traditionally have considered it. So in that respect, our deterrence needs to both be a conventional one, but also one that meets an understanding of where they come from. But a challenge in that for all NATO members, the United Kingdom in particular, is identifying what those are. So you can identify the steps on that process, precisely to the point of your challenge, at what point would you do what? Well, if you can't identify them, and importantly, if you can't attribute them, which I think the attribution is a really important capability that we have shown that we want to do, well, then you might not be able to read or see the path that may take you there, which would allow us to put in measures to deter that, because it's certainly in our interest to deter aggression rather than to necessarily have to defeat it. But to be able to identify it and attribute it, well, that's an important part in the steps towards that genuine deterrence that we need.
Excellent, thank you. That before I allow the DG to add comments, we're trying to gather evidence, and I'm trying to take you on a path so that we can inform our report rather than just clips for social media. And so it's quite important that we go on that journey and I'll come on to attribution separately because that's the second half of my question. But the important thing I would ask us to perhaps take away is that your acknowledgement that an Article 5 response is primarily a political response. And so if you would allow me perhaps to extend it to those that sit with you.
A political decision. The response itself can take any number of means and may well be very military. I mean, the Minister's covered it, but it's probably worth just kind of coming back to, we talked a little bit about definitions earlier. The nature of hybrid grey zone, whatever you want to call it, is an adversary seeking to do us harm, generate coercive effects, generate advantage in a manner that they judge is below the Article 5 threshold, essentially. That's a way that we could describe the thing that you're talking about. And that makes answering this question a bit difficult, because you'll understand we don't want to give the adversary too many hints as to how far they can go. It's absolutely the case, as the Minister has highlighted, that there are examples of attacks that would have been considered kind of hybrid and non-warlike in the past, such as cyber, where NATO has been very clear that they consider that kind of an attack at a scale would merit consideration as an Article 5 response, and we've been very, very clear on that. I think the other thing that I would observe, actually, is, curiously perhaps, the only time Article 5 has been invoked was in the context of what in some ways could be described a hybrid event. So yes, it was a terrorist attack, but it was a terrorist attack with a connection to a degree of state sponsorship, and our subsequent military campaign in Afghanistan was directly as a result of that attack, and in the context of NATO invoking Article 5. So this is not an outlandish proposition. We have, in recent observed history, used Article 5 to address a hybrid event.
Okay.
And I think from my perspective, I would bring it back, to answer your question, how can defence counter that threat? It all comes back to the deterrence message, really. And, the traditional 4 Cs of credibility, capability, comprehension and communications, defence has recognised actually there's a 5th C there, which is competition. And that's pretty much everything that we've spoken about this morning, and being ready and able to compete across all domains whenever the need arises. Now, does that mean that we can see every threat that's coming all of the time and that none will get through? I think that's unrealistic. But being as well prepared as we can be to look at, and all of this needs to be underpinned by understanding and our intelligence picture. But as long as we can do that to the best of our ability, then that will put us in the best place to make sure that we are that credible deterrence.
Brilliant, thank you very much. To follow on from where you took us, Minister Pollard, the second part of my question, and that we would like some understanding of, is that journey from identifying the things that you consider that you would respond to, that we understand, but we wouldn't necessarily want to publish. It's just that it's important for us to have a semblance of idea of what they would look about. And to be able to understand what the attribution mechanisms to prevent escalating tensions are, so that we can maintain that integrity of an Article 5 response. So to come back to a point that you made, Director, which was about doing us harm. So the head of MI5 warned in October last year that Russian intelligence had been on a mission to generate sustained mayhem on British and European streets, and I would describe that as harm. Within my constituency, there was an article that was put out by The Guardian, very well sourced, and article about the network of Telegram channels, not with US personnel in them, but with Russian links, encouraging UK residents to commit violent attacks on mosques and Muslims, offering cryptocurrency in return. In France of 2024, we saw attribution of Russian FSB agents in anti-Semitic graffiti campaign that was seen across France. And in Lithuania in March 2025, Russia was accused of the IKEA store fires. So to come back onto the harm and the need for attribution, how can we improve our attribution mechanisms for incidents in order to counter this escalating tensions?
I think the first thing I'd say is that we've got lots of examples in recent history of actually a very effective attribution system working. So if you roll back to the defence intelligence briefings that were made public in the run-up to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, that was deliberately designed to counter the Russian narrative that they were not planning to invade Ukraine, with the very clear evidence of the build-up of Russian forces, the very clear intelligence of the conversations, the ability to attribute and declassify and communicate that intelligence, thus becoming just information, I think is a really clear example of actually how using the assessment tools that we have across government, including our intelligence partners, both owned by the government departments and defence intelligence part of the MOD, we're able to call that out. And I think, across recent years, we've had, in the cyber domain, for instance, the attribution of Chinese state-backed hacking and cyber attack on the Electoral Commission, seen to undermine our electoral integrity. We've seen activities that we can, with our allies, attribute activities of Russian actors taking action against our allies, especially those in Eastern Europe. So the system we have of attribution works very well. the intent to actually call it out, because there's a big difference between intelligence thinking, we think it's them, we've got the evidence, we know it's them, and then the decision to say, okay, and with that, we're going to put it in the public domain. We're going to attribute it clearly to them. That is a confidence piece that is about building the credibility of both our intelligence systems, but also directly countering the misinformation that will come from and the malign activities of our adversaries. So we've got that system. I think increasingly one of the bits that I would like to see more in the hybrid space, in the kind of like the nexus of cyber intelligence, some of the sub-threshold activities that may be further away from conventional end of that spectrum, because it is a continuum where we're looking at here, is I think the greater joining up of our systems across government. We've got good operations that already join us up, to the point I made earlier to Mike, the Cabinet Office and some of the functions that sit in the kind of convening part of the centre of government are really good at bringing together intelligence across government to be able to have a full picture, because the intelligence from one part of our system may not provide the full picture, and that collaboration that our people do on an increasing basis, on an integrated manner, is so important to providing the foundational information we need to make an attribution. That's working, but we'd like to do that more, and we'd like to integrate, especially some of these services across government in an increasing way. And I think that's behind the broad approach that you're seeing across government at the moment about how we bring together our capabilities to deliver effect, and attribution being one of those.
So, as the Minister said, I think there's the integration of our assessment activities. So the chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee and the Joint Intelligence Organisation are sat at the top of an assessment community, which includes the intelligence agencies and defence intelligence, and bringing all of that together to provide the best possible picture is a really key part of the way in which we address these issues and allow other agencies, police, the National Crime Agency, others, to harden the environment. So it's that kind of information that allows that hardening and the communications with allies. And on some of the kind of threats that you've outlined, in particular those that were outlined by the DG of MI5, you won't be surprised to hear we talk a lot with our allies around what we're seeing and what they're seeing, so we can mutually harden each other's endeavours. From a defence perspective, narrowly, really defence intelligence are right at the forefront of that, and they provide a really important contribution to the wider assessment efforts that we can really understand and then act.
Thank you. So both the examples, I'm glad, Director General, that you pulled on those remarks. The examples I've given you are examples of our head of our intelligence services narrating what is happening to us in a way that we can attribute, perhaps not directly, but in a hybrid method ourselves. And there is, I note that there have been some very powerful reports from, say, the United States Department of from the State Department about the Kremlin's use of anti-Semitic propaganda. There's a very in-depth report that they released last year. Do you think that perhaps this is something that our intelligence agencies or broader government needs to do to address, tackle, identify and counter things like the very obvious use of Telegram on the violent attacks that we saw on Muslims, our Islamic communities and mosques earlier in the year?
I think the work that the Home Office has conducted with its own strategic security review, I think, delivers much of the intent that you're after in that respect. And I think one of the challenges that we'll have once the SSR and the SDR report effectively is how can we create a more integrated model with a greater clarity and fidelity on the threats we're facing, because it is certainly true that across the security apparatus of government there'll be some that will focus on domestic threats, others on international ones, but let's also be clear, in many cases we're seeing state-based activity engage a network which includes both international activity and domestic activity. So the idea that you can easily stovepipe it, as perhaps we might have wanted to in the past in our description of our activities, is much harder now because of the complexity of the activities, but also on the geographical reach of them. So we are seeing, for instance, malign activities from Iran, North Korea, engaging in different types of hybrid activities than perhaps the Russians do. And our approach needs to be alive to the broad range of threats that we have, and sometimes how those threats are interplay together, and our ability to call them out, both in terms of the hateful misinformation that may exist online and understanding about where it's coming from, how you address that, both in terms of a UK context, but also in terms of, say, interference with an election overseas, for instance. We need to work with our partners to be able to challenge some of that, but the ability for us to collect that data, to work with our allies to interpret it and analyse it properly, I think is a real strength that the United Kingdom has, and it's certainly something that our allies really benefit from and have a respect for the UK's role in.
Good. Thank you very much, Minister. I just want to move the conversation from defence's role in deterrence to issues around a whole of government approach, and to get us started off, Lincoln Job, please.
Yeah. I'm tempted to say thank you, Mr. Hacker, but I won't. We went and visited the National Cyber Force and Strategic Command, and we were briefed on, I think at one stage, there was some phrase, a Whitehall customer group. So this question is about our own grey zone within Whitehall. Mm-hmm. And so obviously, if bad guy attacks NHS IT systems, that's obviously the defensive play and part of the national cyber strategy. Can you just talk us through a bit of the governance around the offensive reaction, to come back to Derek's point about do we go and clip their cable? Without sort of clearly, going too far into the out of bounds box. It's not obviously a Department of Health function to want to go down range and do bad things to the King's enemies, but it is in ours. Does that mean that defence plays more of a role in that customer group when it comes to offensive?
The work of the National Cyber Force, I think, is incredible. And by its very nature, NCF is cross-government anyway, because of the sponsorship by a number of different government departments. I think it's worth saying that before you get to any point where we're looking at what is the offensive cyber action, there would be both the attribution, so the understand of what has happened, and then the attribution to an actor. And that may be not necessarily the immediate actor that took the offensive cyber action against us, but that might be who commissioned it, who paid for it, and the whole system that may come from it. What we do with that information doesn't necessarily always mean a tit-for-tat approach, because one of the strengths that the UK has is that we have a range of measures within our toolbox that allows us to calibrate what is the right response, both on a deterrence point, both on terms of a restoring order point as to where we get to. And I think in the example you use, I might ask Matt just to give the approach of what would happen in that scenario, but it doesn't necessarily, and I think it's important for us to realise that we are not our adversaries. So our approach to how we deal with those would be different from how they would calculate an approach towards the UK in the first place. But that doesn't mean that that approach is any less strong or determined. It just means it may take different forms than the initial attack on our systems.
Thank you, Minister. I think all I would just to add to what the Minister said is, of course, the reaction doesn't always need to be in the same domain either. So just because it's a cyber attack doesn't necessarily mean that something, a cyber reaction needs to take place. But as the Minister's already said, we will take all of that information and work out what the best reaction to it. Going back to your specific question about the Whitehall customer group, though, and within the cyber domain, that is essentially a prioritisation group. So all of government departments can put in what their cyber priorities may be, and then at the correct level of government can actually decide where the resource of the National Cyber Force can be aligned to over the course of a set period. So it may sound quite a transactional group, but really it's a prioritisation mechanism to give the National Cyber Force its priorities from a cross-government position. Hopefully
I guess
If I can just offer a couple of 4 examples in that space. So, kind of, you won't be surprised to hear that we're a customer. Our Home Office colleagues are as well. So, kind of as an example of operational activity that the NCF has talked about it conducting. So, the NCF absolutely, as part of the Ministry of Defence's command and control system, has a responsibility to deliver cyber effects in support of operations, some actively, but mostly actually in the contingent space, just as you'd expect from the Navy, the Army and the Air Force. In the event of something occurring, we expect the response to be across all 5 domains. So we ask the commander of the NCF to be ready to contribute cyber effects in support of military activity. One of the things that we've talked about in the past of the government is the Home Office have asked the NCF to help them in terms of child sexual exploitation and internet site takedown. And there's a legitimate conversation about how much relative time they spend doing one or other of those 2 things and other demands that come from other parts of government.
I'm glad you said that last bit, because the way in which we've been talking up until now suggests that the sort of hybrid activity sort of stops when the war goes hot, and that's almost sort of it seems from the outside that defence has sideslipped in a period of relative low military activity for the last 10 years. It's kind of sideslipped into this. It's found it's unerringly can do. It's got some great people, and it's developed some capability, and we're briefed is going to get bigger and bigger. There is a temptation, clearly, when you escalate up to conflict, that all your ploughshares get turned into swords again, because that's what you're really there for. But of course, this isn't like that, is it? And you're very much the hybrid operations must run alongside the kinetic ones in any future conflict.
I agree. I think one of the bits that you will see more from this government, just in terms of our prioritisation of approach, is our approach on all-domain warfare, as distinct from looking at a particular domain and the effects that can be achieved in that domain. If we want to have the kinetic effect on a target, whatever that may be, that will probably not be able to take place without all domains contributing something to delivery of that kinetic effect. So that will include space and cyber, and it will include the capabilities both of individual services and the joint environment to be able to deliver it. And I think an understanding about how we deliver effect now means that by default, any offensive and indeed defensive action is integrated. It does cover all domains by default. And as part of that, we need to make sure that the systems that interplay between those domains can speak to each other, understand the prioritization, and understand their immediate involvement in delivering that effect. Now, I talk quite vocally about my dislike of multi-domain integration as a concept, because I think it's a journey. All-domain warfare is a destination. And I think when we're looking at how we articulate a change in doctrine.
I'm sure that phrase meant a lot to you when it came out of your mouth, Minister, but I'm a simple soldier, so, just...
As a simple soldier, I don't believe that for a moment, but I certainly do think multi-domain integration is about how you get the different domains working together. So how do you integrate a domain with another domain for a particular thing? Well, that's very much a necessary, immediate, and a given for all our activities. So we've gone from how do you integrate one domain to another, both on a theoretical basis, should we? How do we do that? Do our systems work together? Do our terminologies work together? Does the digital backbone that sit behind it work together? To now, as default and standard, for all UK military operations, it is all domain by default. Now, that changes, I think, how we piece together the ability for us to conduct operations. It means that for us to have effective operations, we need all parts of our military system understanding and cooperating together. But to Derek's question earlier, it also makes it harder for us to cost the individual effect, because effectively you're now drawing from across the entirety of the UK armed forces, and indeed sometimes our allies and partners, to be able to deliver that effect, rather than just saying, a plane took off, it dropped this bomb, it flew back, it took X amount of fuel, X amount of wear, X amount of staff time in order to put it together. That delivering that similar effect now will involve space, cyber, maritime forces, joint command, and doing so, it will involve all domains. That does mean that how we structure and how we operate needs to change, but it also means how we respond to hybrid challenges as well as conventional challenges needs to be reflective of the fact that we can now draw on the very best talent across all our armed forces as standard, and I think that improves our lethality, improves our response time, but it also means we're not locking ourselves out of options that might otherwise be available because we just don't have one bit of the military with the connections to another bit. And that's increasingly why, our joined up commands, PGHQ in Northwood, for instance, play a critical role in choosing the best parts of all our military to deliver an effect, whatever that may be.
Thank you.
Thank you much. Michelle Scroggin, please.
Thank you, Chair. On the committee's recent visit to Finland, we saw how their security committee and the MOD work and coordinate long-term across government planning so that they can better prepare society to be able to counter hybrid threats. Do you think this is something that the UK should be emulating?
Seeing Finland, myself, I was in Finland a week after the committee was there meeting ministers to talk about our mutual support for Ukraine. I think the context of Finland, I think, is really to be understood. So until recently, until they joined NATO, they were very proud of their independence. And because of the proximity and their experience with Russia, they've taken a very different approach to a whole of society approach. And that proximity, I think, drives different behaviours, but it also, as a standing assumption, it drives different assumptions from the public about what their responsibility is to national defence, what their obligations are, how they will be taught in schools, what their role is in terms of experience with the military, and in the event of conflict, what they do, which is different to how the UK has traditionally acted. Certainly, I think there are things we can learn from not just Finland, Sweden, Baltic states, but Norway, as a longer-standing NATO member, for instance, about how we can create the links between society, how we can be clear about what the threats are and what we need from people to be able to do it, the interactions. So, as an example, we touched on it earlier, I think our lay-down and structure of reserves doesn't meet the moment at the moment, so that is something that we are looking at as a government to reflect in the event of us needing to draw on that wider pool of people that exist within society with military experience. How do you do that? Finland and our Baltic allies have a much clearer, more operationalised versions of those. So some of those are learning from the experiences of our allies. Others are getting our house in order in more difficult times. I think reserves is a good example of that. But how Finland, Baltic states, Nordic colleagues have a civ mil options in terms of their industrial capabilities, but also their national infrastructure, so airports, maritime ports, that is different from how the UK has historically been structured in recent years. And I think the challenge that we have to have is, I don't think it's a model you can just pick up and say and just run with, because the context is very different. But there's certainly lessons that we can learn. My experience of the conversations I was having on my recent visit to Finland, precisely around this area, was what conversations do we need to have with the British people in the first instance? And that is about a clarity on what is the threat we face, what we can do about it, because I think a knee-jerk reaction would be unhelpful and also not necessary, but a greater clarity on what is the threat, why are we investing in defence, and if we are investing in defence, how do we do that? So I mentioned earlier about intent to spend more money with SMEs. Well, that's not just a good growth reason, because it creates jobs in our community. It is directly supporting a resilience option, and that's one of the key bits around the Finnish model, is a greater national resilience.
And I think this is exactly where I'm heading for with this. It's more about the whole of government approach and the resilience within our community. So our predecessors, in one of their evidence sessions, they were looking at the fact that 90% of what will be on the internet in 2027 will be fake or false. And the kind of resilience in our society to be able to combat that, to understand it, to be able to take that apart and realise which is fake and which isn't. Mm-hmm. Do you feel government has done enough on that, or is that something that we could learn from, again, with a whole of society approach into how we counter the hybrid threats?
I don't think any government worldwide has got this right yet. Certainly, if you look at the progress that was made with the last government's Online Safety Act, notwithstanding the big holes that, as a party in opposition, we were highlighting, that did highlight, I think, that there is misinformation online. There's a responsibility of individuals to be able to call it out, and an understanding about how, as an individual, do you identify misinformation? How, as participation in structures or workplaces, we prevent that information being shared more broadly. But also, what's the responsibility of the platforms where the information is being shared? And I think one of the roles that the UK has as a nation that is proud of its democracy, proud of its adherence to international law, is how do we make a case against misinformation that's true to those values? Because we're certainly seeing malign actors flood our social media with misinformation, sometimes deliberately targeting a community, a demographic, an event with a piece of content or sustained content. But we're also seeing just a general fuzziness of the information picture. So there is a benefit for our adversaries in eroding trust and confidence, not necessarily saying instead of having view A, move to view B, which may be in their interest, but actually just confusing the picture so people can't identify the truth or credible information being shared by reputable sources from disinformation, and eroding confidence in the sources that will be providing credible information. Now, that fuzziness of that picture, the 97% figure that you mentioned, well, that is a real challenge that we need to address. I think our role as defence is only one part of that bigger HMG approach, and that does mean, for instance, greater responsibility of DCIT in that picture. Would then, I think many people, including many parliamentarians, I suspect, will understand how critical their role is, as well as this. So that's why that whole of government approach is vital.
It did appear in Finland that it was a whole of government approach with education, DCIT, all of those joined up together, which is why I was asking, is that something that you think we should be emulating? Obviously, the threats they face in Finland are somewhat different to what we face here, but their approach to it would seem very well-rounded.
Yeah, I think broadly, this government wants to see a whole of government approach to our national security in all its facets, and a whole of society approach in how we deliver it. It's one of the reasons why, in making the case for increased defence spending, you will notice the Defence Secretary, the Prime Minister, and myself in media interventions spending more time in many cases talking about procurement and industry and jobs than necessarily about which bits of kit or capability we're buying, because I think we need to make the case that increased defence investment has a benefit that is not just in the abstract deterrence place. That's not just about buying weapon systems. It's about underpinning economic well-being for our entire nation. And I think, when the Prime Minister speaks about national security being part of national renewal, well, that is about keeping us safe, absolutely. But it is also about how people can feel part of that broader endeavour. So if you were to take a hybrid threat that every single person in this country could do something about on cyber, well, if everyone updated their operating systems on their phones and laptops, this country would be enormously safer. Now, that's not an MOD responsibility. We update our systems. In fact, we are very vicious about updating our systems, as I sometimes know when I try to turn on my phone. But it's really important that we do that. We take that seriously. But if everyone did that, well, that reduces the opportunities for malign actors to be able to exploit systems, to be able to rip information from people, to be able to place things on people's phones or do whatever they may want to do. Well, that's something that requires a whole of society approach. But that does mean everyone needs to know why it's not just about getting the latest feature on the operating system when you do it, that there's a security benefit for that individual, for their data, their information, their finances, but it also speaks to a small contribution everyone can make to our wider national security picture as well.
And lastly, what do you feel government is hoping to achieve from its home defence programme?
I think we need to be safer. We need to create greater deterrence, and we need to support our allies in doing so as well. And those objectives are entirely consistent with that NATO first approach that you've seen outlined since July last year, of us working to support our partners. I think there's also a lot of people who are generally concerned about the world out there at the moment. And I think one of the key jobs of the Ministry of Defence and of government is to provide the confidence of our people that we have good people with the right equipment and the right approach, the right friendships across our international space to keep ourselves safe, and to recognise that our security depends on the security of others as well. Now, that's a big mission, and certainly I have been quite struck by just how many of our international friends are looking for British leadership, especially at this time. And they're seeing it in what the Prime Minister is doing in relation to Ukraine. But they're also aware that, you know, just as President Trump has correctly asked Europe to spend more on defence, something that, to be honest, America has been saying for a very long time, Europe needs to step up. We need to step up, and indeed we are, with increased defence spending. But how we spend it and how we create a force across Europe that is more than the sum of its parts, where we're genuinely interoperable and interchangeable, where our deterrence function is stronger and it's underpinned by the popular support of each of the populations in every nation, NATO member, well, that creates a much higher deterrence against Russian aggression than we can achieve if we just spend money and keep that defence spending within our own boundaries in terms of where we put our kit and equipment and people. So we've got a big challenge to meet, but I think the approach we're taking and having some of the conversations early about what a whole of society approach is, I think will help us with that. But I would much prefer a whole of society approach that shows a benefit for people engaging, serving in the armed forces, looking at their business's technology, because there's loads of businesses out there that won't think of themselves as a defence company, for whom they could be making a substantial contribution to not just their bottom line by doing so, but to our national security. That's a broader conversation we've got to have.
Yeah. Thank you. I believe Lincoln Jock wanted to come in just on this point.
Yes, it strikes me, listening to you talk there, Minister, that I think we have got a bit of a problem in as much as our messaging isn't quite as clear as it could be. You said it wouldn't be helpful to sort of come in and tell the people that, you know, that they're under threat, because that would be counterproductive. But equally, you do want to take the public with you. There isn't, you know, you're clearly walking a very delicate line in terms of what you're saying about Russia. There are deliberate attacks on our information space to inject doubt into people's minds as to whether they are a bad guy. And the last 24 hours haven't helped. I'll just put it as like that. So without putting you on the horns of a dilemma or asking you to pick sides, would you like us as a country, or probably as a government, to just dial up a little the threat perception in the minds of the people of Britain?
I think we're already doing that in being clear with the British public what the threats are that we're facing, and to be able to marshal that in a clear way. That's why we commissioned the SDR. So when the Strategic Defence Review reports, it will set out a clear assessment of the threats we're facing as a nation, and that will, I think, contribute to that national debate as to why we are spending as a government more on defence, what is the reason behind those decisions, and how are we doing it that can benefit more people. I think what we need to do is be very aware that in all these debates, I think all parliamentarians on a cross-party basis, I think, are making the case that we live in more difficult times, They use different languages and different approaches, but I think there's cross-party agreement on that. But what we have to do is find a way of taking the public on that journey with us, because there will be actors that are seeking to deliberately undermine confidence in both the voices of myself as a minister and the armed forces and our Ministry of Defence, just as much they will of individual politicians that make that case as well. Definitely. So we've got a lot of work to do there still.
Thank you very much. Jesse Norman, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wyatt, this is the Strategic Defence Review we've got underway at the moment, just been filed. In recent past, we've had Strategic Defence and Security reviews. Is there, you're the Director of Security, is there any difference between those two things, an SDSR and an SDR, or is it just someone forgot the other words?
There you go, shall I? Please. So yes, there is a difference. The Strategic Defence and Security reviews, and indeed the integrated review, were whole of government endeavours, and they were focusing on aggregate national security. And I was fortunate enough to be part of the defence team that did the SDR in 2015. The SDR that we're currently conducting is a defence-led activity, and it's looking particularly at defence capabilities and issues. It's doing so in the context of other reviews, such as the security review that's being conducted, led by the Home Office, and it will be brought together by the government into a single and coherent picture, as the Minister had described earlier. Perhaps to slightly anticipate your question, so why an SDR? So I'll offer a personal view, which is I think a series of SDSRs and integrated reviews did a very good job of addressing national security, but there is a particular issue around defence reviews, and they're able to get more fundamentally at the force structure and posture of the armed forces in a way in which I think perhaps we're tempted to gloss over or not get into quite such depth when we're thinking about national security. The SDR, conducted by the review team led by Lord Robertson, will have the ability and has had the ability to get into some really deep conversations with our military capability people and the single service chiefs to think fundamentally about the frame of the armed forces at a depth that we probably wouldn't have been able to do if we'd simply been doing a national security review.
Okay, that's very helpful, thank you. So we should, as parliamentarians, expect an SDR which is much more tightly focused on force structure, deployment, the kinds of deep issues you've described, however much of that is put into the public domain or kept privately within government.
So it absolutely allows us to have that deeper consideration, yes.
That's the point of it, in part, is what you're saying. Okay, so then the question is, given all of the concerns that we've heard expressed about the need for a whole-of-government review, all of the different issues about attacks on critical national infrastructure, which could be extended to lawfare, weaponizing migrant flows and all those other things, why was it appropriate to ignore those things from within the wider defence context, which is what we're really considering?
I think that's probably one for me rather than the official, if I may.
Yeah.
I don't think we are undertaking that perspective as you present it. I think what we are on the counter view actually is having a clear focus on our defence structure. So it is, I think, beyond doubt that the war in Ukraine has changed the way we think about conflict and the way we would actually fight a conflict. Based on the experiences that we are seeing, if only because our doctrine doesn't allow for the pervasive nature of drone warfare in the way that we are now seeing in Ukraine. So there does need to be a change in our broad approach. The other difference between the SDR and previous iterations of defence reviews is it's externally led. And having someone outside of the government apparatus leading and following the path that they wish to go down, delivering against the terms of reference set by the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and the Defence Secretary, has been very helpful, I think, in shining a light on the bits of the military that sometimes the military might not always want a light shone on, especially when we're approaching it from a situation where I think on a cross-party basis there is an understanding that we have hollowed out and underfunded our military for quite some time. So what we ask our military to do and what they have the capabilities to do may be different from the public-facing perception. That's why that kind of like zero basing of defence with an SDR and deep defence reform in parallel is a very different context as we had in previous SDSRs. And
Okay. So what it does mean within the context of this inquiry is that a more tightly focused SDR is going to be less engaged with and competent to consider the defence aspects of hybrid warfare, because those aspects affect much wider bodies of interest and potential security threats across the whole of government and society.
I mean, it's precisely why we're bringing together as a government the SSR, the SDR, the various reviews, and there's additional ones across government, into a single national security strategy. So that is what I think is at the basis of your question. Where does it get at it? It gets at it in terms of that broader national piece. What we do need, I think, is a very clear understanding of what defence's role is, what is the structure that we need, and the Strategic Defence Review is by its very nature strategic. So it won't be setting out, I don't think, the precise number of paperclips on any particular bit or precise number of things, but it will be setting out the broader strategic shape that we need to have for our forces, and then it will be for the Ministry of Defence to align our forces against that vision. That will be set out in the SDR. So I think in that respect, I think we will get a very clear focus on defence, are the threats, the capabilities that we need, but all our capabilities, and just to reinforce this, they don't exist on their own. They exist as part of that wider HMG package of measures. So if we're deploying any activity, it is part of that broader thing, and those broader non-MOD components are being looked at by different departments, but being brought together in the National Security Review.
I mean, that's the point I'm making to you rather than the point you're making to me. They do run more widely. Okay, so we heard recently that the latest draft of the final draft of the SDR has now been given to government. Is that right?
So work is still ongoing with it. I think it would be for Lord Robertson to make announcements on the progress.
So that hasn't. We don't know what the status of that is, or you're not prepared to say what the status of that is. We don't know what it hasn't. The final. We don't know the final one has been delivered.
So work is still ongoing.
Okay.
So I think the Prime Minister described the work as being advanced at this stage, but I think it is for Lord Robertson to make announcements on the progress of his review.
How much of an embarrassment or difficulty is created by the fact that all of the underpinning assumptions of European defence and security policy have been upended by recent events?
I think it reaffirms the reason why we're doing a defence review.
But except that the thing was going for eight or 9 months before the events that upended it. Well, the question is, how long is it going to be further prolonged before we get the reposturing that would inevitably be required by the changes we've seen to US cooperation potentially in a whole range of areas that I do not need to enumerate?
Yeah, I think some of the underlying assumptions are still broadly the same, though. We are still seeing Russian activity in Ukraine using different tactics and doctrines as we may have viewed in the past. We still have a situation where the US is a key partner for the United Kingdom and will remain so. We know that there are new capabilities we need to develop. Indeed, there are old capabilities we need to retire to free up the resources and the people to invest in those new capabilities. And that is the challenge that I think we have. I have no doubt that Lord Robertson is well aware of the events, and actually I think the access that he has as a former Secretary General of NATO, I think gives him an unparalleled insight to be able to create the report that is true to what the threats we face as a nation. But certainly it underpins the need for a NATO first approach, it underpins the need for defence procurement reform, it underpins the need for us to realign our force structure and how we value our people.
Okay, thanks. I mean, final question. My constituents in Herefordshire are not particularly confused about the importance of national security and defence. But that's not true about the whole country. And you have been, I think, rightly saying that, as it were, the awareness, the clarity of communication needs to be increased. So, given the complexities of non-attributed, for all kinds of reasons, hybrid warfare, how do you, as a minister, or how do colleagues plan to join the dots on what could be attacks on critical infrastructure, could be, as I say, other forms of intervention in migrant crossings, lawfare, a whole range of other social media contexts? How do you join the dots so that people realise that what they're getting is part of a wider pattern and is not necessarily to be taken at face value?
It's quite a challenge, I think, and I think that's one of the reasons why our adversaries undertake hybrid activities against ourselves and our allies, because there is a difficulty in attribution, and when that is accompanied by misinformation as well as an effect that is deliberately designed to confuse a population or to cast doubt on the underpinning assumptions. So you're right in the fact that this is a difficult space to operate in. I think how we respond to it is with clarity on where we can attribute activities, where we can call it out, where we can be clear about the capabilities that we need, but also what are the additional capabilities, not just in the MOD, but across government and in industry. That feels like the right conversation to have, the right debate to have, and that is what I think the SDR is prompting, as well as the events that we're seeing on our TV screens. But we still need to make a clear case as to why defence investment, delivered in the way we're proposing, will deliver the maximum benefit for not just our national security, but our economy and our people, but also relate that to individuals. So a good example would be Putin's invasion of Ukraine spiked energy prices worldwide. That directly contributes to higher energy bills at home. Being able to, when we make a case for any politician, not just a minister, to be able to make the case of, the reasons we pay high gas and energy bills is directly, one of the reasons is because of Putin's illegal invasion. That reinforces that our security is not just about what happens within our own country, it's about what happens further afield as well.
Thank you.
To bring that close there, just want to bring in briefly before, I know time is fast defeating us, but I wanted to quickly bring in Fred Thomas and Derek Twigg on a couple of issues which we wanted to get on record. Fred Thomas, please.
Thank you. Very quickly then, quick fire question since we're about to end, and with the assumed kind permission of the Minister, straight to yourself, Air Commodore, you're the head of military strategic effects. What are military strategic effects? If you can distill it to a sentence.
My department is responsible for the orchestration and cohering of all effects across all domains, whether that be hard kinetics, information operations, or cyber.
And how many people work for you directly?
It does vary on a regular basis, but circa 50.
Around 50.
Yeah.
How much of your work is contingent on the very long-standing, close joint intelligence sharing we have with the USA?
Significantly, as you would expect, but
it's a rough percentage, if you could.
I don't think I could put a figure on it. Because
not able to give us a rough idea of how much of your work relies on intelligence sharing with the US.
The intelligence that comes to me has been delivered by either the JIC or specifically defence intelligence. So I would have to go back to... I don't personally know. I'd have to go back to defence intelligence and work out a percentage.
How much of your job and your 50 people's job do you think would not be able to happen without our current relationship with the US on intelligence sharing?
Again, that's really difficult to try and put some kind of metric on, because hitherto, despite current situations being played out in the media, at the working level within ourselves and the Department of Defence, I haven't seen a single change.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Derek Twigg, please.
If you look at RFA Proteus in terms of protection of undersea cables, you could say that's more suited to a hybrid type of protection. Basically the question is to you, do you need more sort of hybrid related assets?
I think we do, and that was the original plan. So RFA Proteus was supposed to be one of two ships when originally planned by the last government. Certainly we're seeing a huge interest in Proteus's capability with our allies, and the ability for us to look at what platforms we need to deliver it. Looking at the Norwegian model, where industry takes a much bigger role in protection of critical undersea infrastructure that they're responsible for, is also something we're looking at. But certainly the work of Proteus, the RFA crew, and the wider defence enterprise that use Proteus and similar capabilities is really quite exceptional, and we would be seeking to invest more in those.
Just to be clear, so you're looking both that you would like more defence assets, but also you're expecting industry to do more?
It's when we look at a whole of society approach, there's some really good models that this is not about a greenfield site and creating a new concept. This is about borrowing best practice. The Norwegians are exceptionally good at this, and there's a real opportunity as we deepen our defence relationship with Norway that it's not just about mill-to-mill engagement. There's a lot to learn from their offshore industries that could really benefit us.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Obviously, we're very, very grateful for the work of RFA Proteus, as well as her sister ship, RFA Stirling Castle. And no doubt I would have wanted to ask questions a bit more detailed around that. Unfortunately, time has defeated us. In fact, I wanted to talk a bit more about the work around misinformation and disinformation. But no doubt we will be questioning ministers in our joint committee on the national security strategy further on those sort of issues. But I wanted also to place on record my gratitude to the National Cyber Security Centre, whom the committee recently visited. And their work is invaluable, especially given that the UK is the third most targeted nation on earth in terms of cyber threats. So that's why I think this inquiry is incredibly important, and I'm very, very grateful to your good selves, in particular yourself, Minister, for making yourself available today to give evidence. Lastly, I wanted, if I may, now that I've got your attention on behalf of the committee, there are various operations happening which we cannot discuss in public within the House of Commons Defence Committee, but I wanted to ask on behalf of the committee if we could have your undertaking for classified or in particular secret briefings on, for example, Operation Kindred or Operation Hurst. Would you be willing to facilitate those, please?
Really happy to. I think we want to create a deeper relationship between Parliament and the MOD, and I think with this group, without phones, I'm absolutely happy having those conversations.
Thank you. Yeah, there definitely won't be any phones. But I am very, very grateful to your good self for giving that confirmation. And also, as I said at the outset, that builds upon the Secretary of State's own undertaking of having a very collaborative, of having a very different approach with the Defence Committee. Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you very much also, Director General and Air Commodore, for your evidence today, which I know will inform the publication of our inquiry. With that, I bring this to an end. Order, order.